There's no doubt that Domi and J.D. Beck played jazz. Their music contains the complex harmonies and voicings of jazz, along with a level of virtuosity that would make Oscar Peterson blush. But on their 2022 album Not Tight, there is also a certain undertone of casual or offhanded minimalism, with short song structures and playful instrumentation that draw from pop music and rhythm and vocal elements from within the hip-hop idiom. Their track, You Don't Have to Rob Me, is a great example of how some of these pop features focus their jazz sensibilities into something more concrete. Let's take a listen. The A section places a monophonic piano melody over a simple bass line. It should already be apparent that this section does not have a consistent key. In fact, this song has so many modulations that I just notated the whole thing without a key signature, adding in sharps or flats as needed. This makes a straightforward functional analysis rather difficult, but we can still analyze patterns in how the modulations occur. Since there are no chords in this introductory section per se, it helps to fit the bass and melody to an intermediate chord shape and then use this to infer the key changes. If we treat this initial figure as an arpeggiated chord, we get an E flat minor 9 at 11. This could either be in the key of E flat minor or E flat Dorian, since the sixth is not played. The subsequent arpeggio could simply be called an E flat major over F, but it also makes sense to view it as an F suspended chord. This also gives us a G natural instead of a G flat, putting us in the key of F minor, F Dorian, or even F mixolydian since the third and sixth are absent. The third arpeggio is the same as the first, but moved upward by a major third. This gives us a G minor 9 at 11 in the key of G minor or G Dorian. We might expect this to move up to a G major over A chord, but instead of G major there is a C major arpeggio, which over an A in the bass gives us an A minor 7 chord. Now the key is A minor or A Dorian. From here there are 4 more arpeggios, all sharing the same shape. First they are played separated by a fourth, and then this pair is moved down by a half step. The first pair consists of a B minor 7 flat 6, followed by a slightly more ambiguous A major at 11 over E, all of which fits neatly into the key of B minor. Likewise, the second pair is B flat minor 7 flat 6 and an A flat major at 11 over E flat, which fits into the key of B flat minor. As you can see, over the course of this 4-measure pattern, the key seems to gradually remove flats or add sharps up until the 4th measure where all the flats are added back in again. This sense of motion is pretty much the central motif of the entire song, though the exact details change from section to section. The continuous sharpening of the key creates this auditory sense of brightening, which is ultimately the exact term I'd use to describe You Don't Have to Rob Me's overall aesthetic. So when we look at the multiple scale options we have for each chord, namely what scale you'd probably use when improvising, I'd probably go with the Dorian scale with a comparatively bright-sounding major sixth. Arguably, you could go with the even brighter mixolydian mode over the F, though there is a pleasing consistency to using only the Dorian mode throughout these 2 measures. We can also look at all this in terms of each scale's equivalent major key. From this perspective, the progression moves from D flat to E flat to F to G, and then a little further up to D before moving a semitone back to D flat. It's easy to visualize these motions on the circle of fifths, sharpening in steps until an abrupt movement back to the original key. But even though this final downward step is quite large, its auditory impact is comparatively small. Moving all the way across the circle of fifths gives a less directional impression than moving around it. In a sense, what we hear most is the scalar separation, namely a semitone, not the circle of fifths separation. While moving from a scale with several sharps to one with several flats may produce an off-kilter sound, its impression as a downward movement is a mere blip. In contrast, the other key changes, most moving not 1 but 2 keys sharp with each step, have an audacious sense of upwardness. Used repeatedly throughout the track, this technique gives an impression sort of like an endless upward staircase. The second repetition of the A section reveals a slight variation in the last 2 measures. Here, the bass line makes several chromatic steps downward, extending that downward chromatic change from the previous repetition. Also, the second arpeggio is changed to better match the new bass pattern. These changes produce 2 new chords, a B flat 6-9 and a D flat major at 11 over A. So while we start from the same key of B minor or D major, the closest key fitting the second chord is F major, only 3 steps away, before generally returning to the realm of D flat major. The A in the D flat major at 11 over A is a bit tricky, not fitting into the same diatonic key as the rest of the chord's notes. However, the downward chromatic bassline ends up with the A flat underpinning the A flat major at 11, providing a sense of justification to the whole phrase. Overall, this more gradual approach to the original key creates a greater sense of directionality. To me, this B-flat 6-9 chord stands out as sounding particularly dark. As we'll see, there are a few places where this kind of harmony interrupts the bright ascending key changes used throughout the song. From here, we proceed to the B section. Vocals take over the melodic role while the piano plays some dense trebly chords. Before we start looking at the modulations, it's worth pointing out the unique chord voicings here. Ordinarily, chord voicings consist mostly of either wide intervals like fourths, fifths, and sixths, i.e. open voicings, or they consist mostly of narrow major and minor third intervals, i.e. closed voicings. But here, the voicings jam together lots of adjacent scale notes, resulting in mostly major or minor second intervals, a technique known as cluster voicing. It was a little difficult to figure out these chords, but I'm pretty sure I got them mostly correct. It's much more difficult to figure out cluster chords if they are played in a low register where they sound quite muddy. There's actually a pretty neat explanation for this. If the notes of a chord are too low, their conflicting higher harmonics will dip into the upper part of our hearing range. Conversely, with high register chords, the upper part of our hearing range is occupied by more widely spaced harmonics. I bring this up because the tighter spacing of notes in cluster chords is analogous to the tighter spacing of harmonics that are higher up in the harmonic series. And since the timbre of a sound is largely determined by its harmonic composition, high register chords with cluster voicings imitate the harmonic structure of bright timbres. And then on top of this, You Don't Have to Rob Me's piano itself has a bright trebly timbre. More to the point, these harmonically bright features combine perfectly with the ascendant sound of this song's many key changes. Anyway, before we define the keys here, let's put some labels on these chords. A B-flat minor 9 over E-flat, then a B-flat minor 9 over F, a G minor 7 flat 6 at 11, an A minor 7 at 11, then a B minor 7 at 11 and an A major 6 9, followed by a B flat minor flat 6 at 11 and an A flat major 6 9 at 11. Overall, these cluster voicings result in a lot of chords with diatonic 6, 9, and 11 extensions, but if you examine the basic triads, they are fairly similar to the chords of the A section. In fact, the A section's key changes fit perfectly well with these chords. But since they are different chords, a slightly different key interpretation might be more fitting. As with the A section, we start off in D flat major, but now there's no reason to modulate up until the G natural is introduced in measure 2, which reflects a key of G minor or B flat major. Next, we end up in what is likely A minor or C major before following a similar route through D major and then D flat major again. So there are a few places where the key differs by one step on the circle of fifths, but the general theme is the same, moving sharper in the circle of fifths by a couple of steps at a time and then making one big leap back to the original key. Another interesting feature of this section is the vocal melody, which has roughly the same downward melodic shape in each measure. This shape has a strong resemblance to the melody that the piano played in measures 3 and 4 of the A section, albeit lengthened to a full measure, creating a sense of section-to-section consistency. After 2 repetitions, we enter the C section, which is quite distinct from the A and B sections. There are no vocals here, just chord-heavy piano and bass. The voicings here are relatively narrow, though not quite to the extent of cluster voicing. As a result, the chords are a little easier to label. G6, A major 9, G flat 6, and A flat major 9, with the G being sustained in the bass under the first 2 chords and the G flat under the second 2. This exact chord pattern doesn't show up in the A or B sections, but it does follow a familiar modulation. The G6 and A major 9 fit into the key of D major, and the G flat 6 and A flat major 9 fit into the key of D flat major. It's as though the last 2 keys from the A and B section patterns were taken and extended in order to last 2 measures each. In the C section, this half-step modulation is highlighted by the absence of other modulations. All we hear now is a sort of queasy cycle between the brighter D major and the darker D flat major. The chord functions in this section also contribute to the sound of this cycle. While You Don't Have to Rob Me mostly avoids functional harmony, the chords here are a clear nod to that perspective, with each pair serving as the 4 and 5 chords of their respective major keys. Perhaps no other pair of chord functions sets up as strong an expectation as the 4 and 5, namely the expectation of resolving to the 1. To put it another way, these functions impart a strong sense of forward movement. In some ways, this quality is analogous to the upward moving modulations in the A and B sections. Both produce a sense of positive tension, of expecting to move to a new major chord or a more major key, but in both cases the expectation is never actually fulfilled. Instead, a subtle half-step modulation is used to reset the growing tension while still maintaining a continuous sound. At least until the transition to the D section, which begins with a D flat 6 chord, creating a quick 5-1 change. It's actually kind of easy to miss, buried in this track's non-stop flood of key changes, though it does help to start off this new section with a more conventional feeling. Nonetheless, from here, the D section shows us yet another way to combine the core elements that the song has used so far. The vocals have returned, and while the melody has a different rhythm, it still has the same general shape as before, with each phrase consisting of a general downward movement. The accompanying synthesizer part uses closed voicing chords to emphasize the upbeats, producing a sort of silly, antic sound. The chords themselves are pretty straightforward, starting with a D-flat 6, moving through a couple of B-flat suspended chords before landing on a B-flat 6, then playing a C sus4 before finally hitting a C-flat major sharp 11. The corresponding key changes are similar to those in the B section, but make one crucial adjustment. We start in the key of D-flat major, move to the key of B-flat major, which now lasts through 2 measures, but then to reach the C-flat major sharp 11 chord, we jump to the key of G-flat major, not our original key, but in fact one step flatter. Plotted on the circle of fifths, these movements still have the general structure of moving sharper in steps before taking a leap backwards, though here the leap is smaller, having a more audible sense of direction. Yet even though the key of G-flat is flatter than any other in this song, its sound is only a little bit dark. This is largely due to landing on the 4 chord of that key, which evokes the very bright-sounding Lydian mode. Furthermore, the last little melodic fragment of this final measure even highlights the D natural, a sharp 2 scale degree relative to C-flat. There are some small variations in this section's overall structure. On the second and fourth repetitions, the last measure's chord is replaced by a movement from C-flat major to D-flat major. And then, on the fourth repetition only, the C sus4 is replaced by a C major chord. This reveals a latent symmetry in the overall progression. The movements from C-flat to D-flat and from B-flat to C are both an upward whole step, with each pair of chords being separated by a semitone. These are the exact same qualities that characterize the 4-5 changes in the C section. Additionally, the upward whole step is the main type of modulation used throughout the A and B sections. The sheer range of these compositional connections is truly amazing, and serves to distinguish Domi and J.D. Beck from other jazz and pop musicians. Overall, You Don't Have to Rob Me uses all kinds of techniques to achieve an optimistic, bright-sounding aesthetic. The biggest factor is the use of key-sharpening modulations that are subtly reset by half-step modulations, producing a sort of semi-continuous feeling of upward movement. But there's also the recurrent use of whole step patterns that imitate 4-5 changes, as well as dense high-register chord voicings that impart a bright timbre. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, while this song uses jazz harmonies and modulations, its most interesting harmonic features are not abstract or improvised. Rather, they are carefully arranged and use a tight song structure and repeated compositional themes, an aesthetic that draws more from forward-thinking modern pop music than from jazz. Ultimately, it's this compact aesthetic that allows Domi and J.D. Beck to cover so much territory in a song that isn't even 3 minutes long. This concludes my music theory analysis of You Don't Have to Rob Me. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.